Welcome. First, a brief official disclosure. Thoughts in this video must not be considered as a medical advice. Our aim is to build a new point of view and start another way of thinking. What if what we have been taught about cellular function is not the whole picture? Not wrong, but incomplete. What if there is a broader model that explains everyday biology more clearly? Let's go a bit deeper and start with something simple, nature. If you look at water, you immediately see something interesting. The same substance can be a soft cloud in the sky or a powerful hurricane. Same chemistry, completely different behavior. Or take another example. Water can travel tens of meters from the roots of a tree to the leaves without any visible pump. And now bring this question closer. Why do we feel tired? Why do we need sleep? Why do we instinctively seek warmth at night? What if many chronic conditions are not simply about visible damage, but about something more fundamental? How the body stores and organizes energy. Because in biology, three elements always work together. Energy, which drives function. Structure, water, connective tissue membranes, which store and direct that energy. And control, the nervous system, which organizes it into coherent activity. Now, here is where it becomes practical. Have you ever noticed how certain symptoms tend to appear together? Runny nose, recurrent infections, cold hands and feet, fatigue, varicose veins. In Western medicine, these are usually treated as separate problems. But in traditional medical systems, often see them as part of a single pattern. Different cultures gave it different names. Qi in China, prana in India, Ruh in Arabic traditions, different words pointing to the same underlying idea. In modern terms, we might begin to understand this as a disturbance in energy production and its downstream effects. But what does that really mean? Let's go deeper. In this talk, we will mention various devices. Vitality vents, which work locally, and P90 platforms, which work both locally and globally. But that's not the main point. The real goal is to understand the system behind them, to translate these traditional observations into a framework that fits Western thinking. Not replacing medicine, but extending it. Many of these tools were originally designed to address what Chinese medicine calls damp cold syndrome. The term may sound unfamiliar, but the pattern itself is not. It often begins when mitochondrial energy production weakens. An energy deficient environment develops, and here comes an important shift in perspective. What if not only the mitochondria matter, but also the environment they work in? Especially water. For now, just hold that thought, because in a low energy state, several changes begin to appear. Energy production drops, the surrounding water networks becomes unstable, structure begins to break down, and tissues start to swell. At the same time, metabolism slows and waste products begin to accumulate. This is what traditional systems describe as dampness. And interestingly, many of these changes are already familiar in Western medicine. But how does the patient actually experience this? Not in theory, but in everyday life. It might show up as a persistent runny nose, low mood or mental fatigue, changes in blood pressure, weight gain, sometimes even without increased food intake, digestive problems, bloating, loose stools, and cold extremities. A constant feeling of cold even in the summer. Sometimes even simple observations can give clues. A swollen tongue with a thick white coating and teeth marks on the side is often a classic sign of this pattern. And if you look at laboratory findings, you may see something similar reflected. Reduced thyroid function, adrenal exhaustion, and blood sugar instability. Different diagnoses, but often the same underlying terrain. And this is just one of the several fundamental patterns described across traditional medical systems along the Silk Road. So the next step is simple. Let's look at these patterns more closely. Let's go a bit deeper. If you look across traditional medical systems, whether Chinese, Indian or Arabic, you start to notice something interesting. They don't primarily describe the body in terms of diagnosis. They describe it in terms of patterns. And these patterns follow a very simple logic. They are organized along 4 basic axes: hydration, dry or wet; temperature, hot or cold; energy, undercharged or overcharged; and organization, ordered or chaotic. Now, to make it easier to imagine, think of the body as existing inside a kind of space, almost like a tower with multiple levels. Each level represents a coordinate system, and your body has a position within it based on these fundamental properties. This may sound abstract at first, but it is not. If it is something you can actually observe. You don't need a laboratory for this. You can start with very simple things. For example, look at your tongue in the mirror. If it is swollen with teeth marks on the side, it often reflects low energy and fluid accumulation in the tissues. Dry skin, dry eyes, and dry mouth, these are clear signs of dryness. On the other hand, puffiness, heaviness, brain fog, these often point towards dampness. Cold hands and feet, fatigue, bloating, these usually indicate an undercharged, internally cold state. And if we look at inflammation, we already know the classical Western signs: heat, redness, and swelling. Add dry stool or dark urine, and you begin to see the pattern of internal heat. Of course, in reality, these patterns often mix, and we will come back to that later. But there is one more interesting state that is often confused with heat: overcharged but disorganized energy. A good example is migraine. Here the problem is not simply too much energy, but energy that has lost its organization. Too much activity without proper coordination. And this distinction becomes important when we start thinking about treatment or support. Because once you recognize the pattern, the intervention becomes almost self-evident. If something is cold, you warm it. If it is hot, you cool it. If it is dry, you moisten it. If it is damp, you help it drain and reorganize. If it is undercharged, you support and recharge it. If it is overcharged, you calm and regulate it. Simple principles, but applied to a complex system. And now we arrive at a key question. If all of this is happening, if energy is moving, if structure is changing, if patterns are shifting, what is the medium where all of this is actually taking place? Let's go a bit deeper. Modern medicine is extremely powerful, especially in acute situations. On a molecular level, it gives us a very precise understanding of the body. Receptors, signal pathways, enzymes, lock and key interactions. These form a highly sophisticated system, and in many cases they allow us to intervene very effectively. But there is a quiet question here. Not a contradiction, just a gap we rarely look at. Because when we describe all of this, molecules interacting, signals traveling, reactions happening, we are focusing on the components. But what about the space between them? What is actually there? What is the medium in which all of these processes take place? because molecules don't exist in isolation. They are surrounded by something. They move through something. They interact with something. And that something is water. Now, in most models, water is treated as a passive background only, a solvent, a carrier, a neutral environment. But what if that is not the whole story? What if water is not just a stage but an active participant? A medium that can store energy, organize structure, and influence how signals travel. Because if that is true, then we are not just looking at chemistry alone. We are looking at a system where structure, energy, and environment all interact at the same time. And that changes how we think about function. So instead of asking only what molecules are doing, we can begin to ask, what kind of environment are they operating in? And that is where the classical model begins to expand. So how do we extend the current model? Let's go a bit deeper. Water is something we see every day, and yet it behaves in a surprisingly different way. Sometimes it is soft and diffuse, like clouds in the sky. Other times it becomes highly structured, like a hurricane, with clear form, direction, and force. Same substance, different organization. Even its basic properties can seem contradictory. Most of the time, water extinguishes fire. But under certain conditions, it can actually contribute to combustion. So the question is, could similar differences exist inside the biological systems as well? Modern research suggests that this may be the case. Water doesn't always behave as a random fluid. Under certain conditions, especially near biological surfaces like membranes and proteins, it may become more organized. Now, this is still an area of active scientific discussion. But instead of focusing only on the debate, we can ask a simple question. How does biology actually use water? And here, nature gives us a very clear example. In plants, water is transported from the roots all the way up to the leaves, often over many meters. This happens in a structure called the xylem. And recent research has shown that water within this system can exist in a more organized state, which helps explain how this transport becomes possible. So at least in this context, water is not simply random. It can become structured and functionally active. And this leads us to an interesting possibility. If water can organize itself within biological systems, could it also provide a platform for other processes to take place? For example, for herbs interacting with the body. Not only at the level of the molecules, but through an environment in which those molecules operate. We will explore this idea in more detail shortly. So let's take a look at who has been exploring these ideas. Let's go a bit deeper. Vladimir Voyaikov, a professor at Moscow State University, proposed that in living systems a large portion of water is not free in the classical sense. Instead, it is closely associated with biological structures, cell membranes, proteins, and DNA, almost like a thin organized layer coating these surfaces. In this state, water may behave differently from what we usually expect. Not just as a passive solvent, but as an active component of the system. One way to think about this is through a simple analogy, like a battery. When it is charged, it can support function. When it is depleted, the system becomes less efficient. If we look at everyday experience, this may help explain something familiar. Why do we need sleep? Not only for rest, but perhaps also to restore and reorganize this internal environment, to recharge, clean, and stabilize it for the next day. And even simple behaviors like seeking warmth at night may support this process. These ideas are not isolated. They are also explored by Gerald Pollack, based in Seattle, who described what he calls structured water, a state of water with distinct physical properties, including the ability to store and separate charge. And interestingly, these properties can be measured and may help explain observations such as water transport in plants. From a historical perspective, it is worth noting that Albert Szent-Györgyi, a Nobel laureate, already pointed in a similar direction as early as 1956, when studying muscle function and the role of energy in biological systems. So while the terminology has evolved, the underlying idea has been present for decades. And in the next section, we will take this one step further and look at how these concepts may help us understand biological function in a more intuitive way. Let's go a bit deeper. In 1956, Albert Szent-Györgyi made a simple but very powerful observation. If we want to understand life, and especially muscle function, we cannot think only in terms of structure. We also have to think in terms of energy. By studying muscle contraction, he noticed something unusual. Muscle is not just a mechanical system. It behaves more like a water-based, energy-sensitive environment capable of entering what he described as an excited state during activity. Not emotional excitement, of course, but a physical state, where energy is not immediately lost but temporarily stored, organized, and then released in a directed way. And this helps explain some very familiar experiences. For example, why can you hold a heavy weight even when your immediate energy supply should already be exhausted? Why does a muscle begin to tremble just before fatigue, as if it were losing stability? And why does rigidity appear after death, when mitochondrial energy production stops completely? Szent-Györgyi's conclusion was simple. Biological function is not driven by ATP alone. It depends on ATP and the physical state of water together. He illustrated this with a simple analogy. The classical model is like saying the wood heats the stove. But in reality, this is the fire that produces heat. The wood only sustains it. In the same way, molecules alone are not enough. There is a deeper layer here, an organized energetic medium in which these processes take place. Szent-Györgyi didn't reject biochemistry. He extended it. He suggested that life operates through excited states, fields, and structured environments closely linked to water. At the time, he didn't yet have the language that later researchers like Gerald Pollack would introduce. But the idea was already there. And this leads to a simple shift in perspective. When biological systems lose their internal organization, we don't just see a chemical problem. We see fatigue, stiffness, inflammation, and loss of coordination. In one word, dysfunction. From this perspective, water is no longer just a passive solvent. It becomes the medium where energy is organized, stored, and translated into function. Let's go deeper. If we look at the structure of many herbal compounds, we find something interesting. A large number of them contain water-loving or hydrophilic groups, which means they don't just interact with receptors. They interact directly with the water environment of the body. And if we connect this to what we discussed earlier, that water can become structured along biological surfaces, then a new possibility appears. What if herbs are not only acting at the level of molecules, but also through the medium in which those molecules operate? This idea becomes even more compelling when we look across traditional systems. Chinese, Ayurvedic, Persian, Arabic, even European herbal traditions. Different languages, different frameworks, but often describing the same underlying pattern. And one of the simplest ways this system is organized is through taste, not just in medicine, but in everyday food. Because taste in this context is not about flavor. It reflects function. For example, bitter substances are often associated with cooling and anti-inflammatory effects. Pungent substances tend to move stagnation and improve flow. Salty substances can organize structure and improve conductivity. Blend substances help clear excess fluid and reduce accumulation. Sour substances stabilize and contract. And sweet substances provide structure, building and supporting the system. Now if we step back, we begin to see a pattern. These are not random effects. They are ways of interacting with the internal environment, especially the water network. And this leads to an important clinical insight. Sometimes what appears contradictory is actually complementary. For example, if inflammation is already hot, why would we sometimes add warming? The answer is simple. Because inflammation often develops in a low energy state. It is in part an alternative way for the system to generate energy. So if we only suppress it, we may reduce symptoms but not restore function. That's why context, timing, and dose matter. During active inflammation, cooling helps control excessive breakdown. But at the same time, a small amount of warming can support mitochondrial energy production. In practice, this is something we already see. For example, in a simple sore throat, alongside conventional treatment, gentle warming support may help recovery. Not by replacing therapy, but by restoring balance. And once the acute phase passes, the strategy shifts. Less cooling, more warming, and gradual rebuilding of the structure. So what begins to emerge is a more integrated view. Herbs are not just chemical agents. They interact with the environment, support structure, and help organize function. And in many cases, their properties reflect the conditions in which they grow. Plants that survive harsh environments often support energy metabolism. Organisms that thrive in damp conditions often help regulate breakdown and recycling. So we are not just using substances. We are working with systems that have already solved similar problems in nature elsewhere. And we will explore these connections in more detail in the next section. Let's go a bit deeper. Following the line of thought of Albert Szent-Györgyi, we arrive at a perspective that Gerald Pollack described as the language of water. And what does that mean in practice? It means looking at the body and at biology in general from a slightly different angle. Not inventing something new, but seeing the same system in a different way. And when we do that, many things that previously seemed unrelated begin to make sense. Interestingly, this perspective resonates with traditional medical systems, Chinese, Indian, Arabic, European, not because they are identical, but because they may be describing the same underlying principles in different languages. Here, we don't use this as a doctrine. We use it as a navigation tool, a way to orient ourselves in complex clinical situations. Let's take a simple example: circulation. We usually think of blood flow as a function of pressure. The heart pumps and the blood moves. But even in fetal life, circulation already works when pressure gradients are minimal. So something else must be contributing. Pollack proposed that flow is not only about pressure, but also about the capacity of the system to conduct flow. And this may depend on the structured water and organization of charge within it. In everyday terms, we can observe something similar. When we are fatigued, the blood often becomes more viscous. Flow slows down. We may not need a laboratory to see this. Sometimes simple observation is enough. For example, the small veins under the tongue may appear more distended in the morning. As flow decreases, capillary circulation slows and fluid can begin to accumulate. Now let's widen the view. The same principle may apply across the body. The skin is not only a protective layer anymore. It is a visible map of microcirculation. Joints are not only mechanical structures. Their function depends on the organization of the water layer within them. When this structure is compromised, we experience stiffness and inflammation. That's why movement in the morning helps, not just mechanically, but because it helps reorganize the system. Even swelling can be reinterpreted. When the ankle is injured and becomes edematous, it is not just fluid accumulation. It is a shift from organized to less organized structure, like a saturated sponge. And the swelling may even serve as a temporary stabilizing pillow. The system applies to muscle function. Excited states, energy transitions, temporary organization. And finally, the kidney. From this perspective, it is not only a filter, but a regulator of water organization and flow. And when the system becomes exhausted, circulation deteriorates. In some cases, the body compensates by increasing blood pressure just to maintain minimal perfusion. So when we step back and look at the whole picture, many symptoms that seem random or pathological begin to look different. Not as failures, but as adaptive responses. And perhaps this is one of the most important messages of this perspective. The body is not simply breaking down. The body is adopting. How can we imagine all of this at the cellular level? Let's go deeper. So far, we have been talking about structure, energy, and water. But how does this actually appear in real life? How does it translate in symptoms like pain, fatigue, or anxiety? One way to think about it is through organization. At a healthy energy level, the internal environment is structured and stable. Signals move efficiently, communication is clear, the system is coordinated. But when energy drops, this organization begins to change. The water network becomes less stable. Structure starts to break down, and communication becomes less precise. In simple terms, noise increases. And this is what we begin to feel. Pain, for example, may not only come from damage, but from instability in the tissue environment. As organized structure collapses, energy is released in an uncoordinated way, stimulating nerve endings. Anxiety can follow a similar pattern. In the brain, loss of organization can lead to internal instability, a kind of background noise that we experience as unease or agitation. Fatigue is another expression of the same process. When the system loses its ability to store and organize energy, performance drops. Muscles weaken, recovery slows, everything feels heavier. And in this low energy state, another process often appears. Inflammation. Interestingly, inflammation doesn't always arise from excess energy. Often it develops in an energy deficient environment. In this context, it can be seen as an alternative way for the body to generate energy through the breakdown of accumulated material. This type of terrain is well known in Western medicine. We often refer to it as predisposition or susceptibility in microbiology, a background state where the system becomes more vulnerable to dysfunction. In some cases, infection may also contribute, but even then the underlying environment matters. So this is not a single event. It is a process, a system gradually shifting from organization to disorganization. And once we begin to see it differently, the question naturally changes. Instead of asking what is the problem, we start asking how can we restore organization, support energy, and help the system to recover. So what can we actually do? If we step back and look at everything we have discussed, a simple framework begins to emerge. We are not working on one level, but on three at the same time: energy, structure, and function. Energy can be supported through physical stimulation, for example, devices such as the Vitality Wand and the P90 systems. Structure can be supported through herbal medicine and nutrition and the biochemical environment we provide. And function we need through conventional pharmacology. The key point is this: these are not separate approaches. They work together, and the goal is not simply symptom control, but improving tissue responsiveness, helping the system to respond again. Let's take a practical example: endometriosis. In Western medicine, it is understood as an inflammatory condition, and that's correct. But if we look from another angle, many patients describe something more: a feeling of internal cold hands and feet, bloating, digestive discomfort. In traditional terms, this is often described as a cold pelvis pattern. Now we are not replacing the current medical model. We are extending it. So what can we do in practice? We can work on multiple levels. Physically, we can apply gentle warming to support circulation and reduce stagnation. Chemically, we can support this with herbs. For example, warming combinations like ginger, cinnamon, or cardamom. At the same time, we can help reduce excess fluid accumulation, what traditional systems all call dampness, using lighter clearing agents. Together, these approaches may help mobilize and reorganize the tissue environment. And importantly, this can be coordinated with ongoing medical treatment, not instead of it, but alongside it. In some cases, we also need to consider the emotional layer, which can significantly influence system regulation. And this perspective is not limited to one condition. It can also apply in situations like chemotherapy or radiotherapy, where supporting recovery between treatment cycles may help the patient enter the next phase in a more stable state. So the idea is simple. We don't replace medicine. We support the system in which medicine operates. And this may help improve outcomes in a more integrated way. Let's bring this into practical terms. The shared principle behind devices like the Vitality Wand, the P90 and the P90 Plus system is actually quite simple. They introduce energy into the same biological system we have been discussing so far. A system that is largely water-based. And when additional energy is introduced, the internal environment may begin to reorganize. Structured states can be restored. Flow may improve, and this often translates into a subjective sense of increased energy. Now, when working with these devices, there are three practical questions to consider. Where do they act? How deep can they reach? And how is energy actually transferred into the tissues? We will explore these in more detail later. But in everyday use, the three factors tend to matter most: repetition, dose, and combination. Repetition means regular application, not a one-off intervention, but a process. Especially with more targeted tools like the Vitality Wand, where basic principles of point selection and local stimulation can influence the outcome. Dose refers to intensity and duration, how much input the system receives. And combination is perhaps the most important, because these devices rarely work on isolation. They are most effective when integrated with structural support such as herbal medicine and, when appropriate, with conventional treatments. Now there are also practical differences between devices. The vitality wand also allows more localized targeted work, often following connective tissue or meridian-based logic, while P90 systems tend to provide a more general whole-body input and may reach deeper structures that are otherwise difficult to influence, such as the pelvis, the spine, or deeper musculoskeletal layers. We will go into more detail on specific applications in the next section. And finally, a brief practical note. For long-term credibility, it is important that devices are presented with clear and transparent specifications, not only for regulatory reasons, but to support proper use, manage expectations, and build trust over time. Because ultimately, these tools are not just products. They are part of a system that needs to be understood in order to be used effectively. Let's take a closer look at the foot-based devices, because their principle is rarely explained clearly. To understand this, we need to go back to something very fundamental: development and developmental biology. In early embryological life, a simple polarity already appears. A positive pole, which later becomes the head, and a negative pole, which develops into the pelvic base and functionally the feet. Between these two poles, a difference in potential is created, a vector, and this vector guides how the body forms: cell migration, tissue organization, overall structure. Now, here is the important point. This is not just something that happens during development. It continues to exist as a functional axis in the adult body. And this is what you see on this slide. On one side, the developmental vector. On the other, what we described earlier as the system state or the tower model. These are not two different ideas. They are the same system seen from two different levels. So what happens if this axis becomes weak? The vector loses strength, flow slows down, organization decreases, and the system shifts toward cold, damp, undercharged states. Clinically, this often appears as fatigue, cold extremities, stagnation, very often centered in the pelvic region. Now let's look at the opposite. If the axis becomes overactive and loses stability, the vector becomes chaotic. Energy is pushed upward without proper regulation, and the system shifts towards heat, overcharge, and loss of coherence, often expressed in the head, for example, as headaches. So from this perspective, symptoms are not random. They are directional, and this has an important implication. If the problem lies in the vector, treating only the surface will rarely be enough. So what do food-based devices actually do? They don't simply add energy. They influence how energy moves. They interact with this vertical axis through the connective tissue of the foot, which forms a continuous network connecting the feet, pelvis, and the head. This is not a mystical pathway. It is a functional communication system within the body. The same system that helped build the body is now used to regulate it. So these devices can do two things. They can support a weak vector, restoring flow and organization, or they can calm an excessive, unstable vector, bringing the system back into coherence. And this leads to a simple but powerful idea. The vector shapes the system state, and the system state defines what we experience as symptoms. So if we change the vector, the whole system begins to change. And this is where the classical model expands, because function is not only about molecules, but about how energy is organized within the system. Is there any scientific equivalent of this electrical vector in Western medicine? The vector itself is not explicitly described in classical biomedical language, but because it is not primarily biomechanical, it is biophysical. But there is a closely related concept that everyday physician already knows. The resting membrane potential. Every cell maintains a difference in charge between the inside and outside. And this difference is essential for function. Without it, there is no signaling, no coordination, no life at the cellular level. So the question becomes, what maintains this state? In classical models, we describe ion channels, pumps, and concentration gradients, all of which are correct. But we can add another layer. According to Gerald Pollack, water itself may play an active role in this process. Under the influence of light and heat, water can undergo charge separation. In simple terms, it can behave like a battery, storing charge, maintaining gradients, and supporting flow. And this stored charge can then be used by the system for signal transmission, for circulation, and for mechanical work, such as muscle contraction, as already suggested by Albert Szent-Györgyi. So if we bring this together, we arrive at a simple working model. This water battery depends on two main factors: energy input, which helps create and maintain charge separation, and structure, which stabilizes the system where this charge is stored. In practice, this means two things: physical energy input through devices such as vitality vents or food-based systems, and biochemical support through compounds that help maintain the structural environment. For example, plant-derived substances such as spirulina, asparagus, astragalus, or goji berry. These are not acting only at the level of receptors. They help build the environment in which energy can be stored and used effectively. So rather than focusing only on molecules, we begin to see a coordinated system here. Energy, structure, and function working together. On the previous slides, we introduced the concept of qi. Let's go a bit deeper. In Western physiology, the closest parallel is the resting membrane potential, a charge difference that allows cells to function, communicate, and respond. But this is only part of the story, because this system is not just electrical. It is organizing. It guides development from the earliest stages of embryological life, and later it supports repair, adaptation, and regeneration. In many Western models, this is often simplified to energy production. How much ATP is generated? And that's true, but incomplete, because generating energy is not enough. That energy must be organized. It must be cooperative, systems working together, coordinated, moving in synchrony, and communicative, exchanging information. What we are really describing is a body-wide network, a bioelectric system running through connective tissue, linking different parts of the body into a functional whole. And this idea is not new. It appears across many medical traditions. Qi in Chinese medicine, prana in Indian systems, and ruh in the Arabic world. Different names for a similar observation. And this flow behaves like both water and electricity. It moves, it performs work, and encounters resistance. And this leads to a very practical insight. Devices can stimulate flow. They can introduce energy into the system, but they rarely resolve resistance, because resistance is not only about energy, it is about structure. And this is where herbal and biochemical support becomes essential. Not just to add energy, but to build the environment in which that energy can move, organize, and function properly. Now we come to the question of local and distant stimulation. Let's go a bit deeper. When we work with the system, we are not limited to a single point of intervention. We can act locally and at the same time influence the system globally. For example, we can introduce energy through devices such as the Vitality Wand or food-based systems. This allows us to support a specific area directly, while also influencing the overall direction of the system, for example, through the feed. Now, local stimulation is not a new idea. In Western medicine, we already use similar principles, for example, in myofascial trigger point stimulation. The logic is simple. If a tissue is painful, it often needs activation or charge. What is newer is how we apply this concept to more complex systems. For example, the brain. Scalp-based stimulation techniques are now used in areas such as stroke rehabilitation, depression, and other neurological conditions. And even though the input is local, the effect can be system-wide. At the same time, classical needle-based approaches have certain limitations. They can be technically demanding, operator-dependent, and sometimes uncomfortable for patients, which makes consistent application more difficult. This is where electrical stimulation offers an alternative. It can be simpler, more reproducible, and easier to apply regularly. But there is an important point here. Energy alone is not enough. Once we introduce energy into the system, we also need to stabilize it. We need structure. And this is where herbal medicine and biochemical support come in. They help build and maintain the internal environment, the scaffold that allows energy to be stored, organized, and used effectively. So we bring this together. We arrive at a very simple principle. Energy provides activation, structure provides stability, and direction determines outcome. And when these three come together, function can be restored. How does this fit with conventional medicine? Let's go a bit deeper. Western pharmacology is highly effective, especially in the short term. It can stabilize acute conditions, reduce symptoms, and in many cases be life-saving. But over time, a different pattern can sometimes appear. The effect may gradually diminish. Tolerance can develop, or side effects may emerge. Fatigue, reduced libido, and cold sensitivity. Now these are well recognized. But we can also look at them from another angle. Not only as drug effects, but as changes in the underlying system. At a deeper level, these patterns may reflect a gradual decline in energy production and the weakening of the internal environment in which the system operates, including the structured water that supports cellular function. And when this environment becomes less stable, the system's ability to respond and regenerate begins to decline. So the question is not, should we use medication or not? The question is, how can we improve the environment in which medication works? And this brings us back to a simple two-directional approach. First, we can support energy through physical input using devices that help stimulate and recharge the system. And second, we can support structure through herbal and biochemical means, helping stabilize the internal environment, support energy production, and facilitate the clearance of accumulated metabolic waste. So rather than replacing pharmacology, we are doing something different. We are restoring the conditions in which it can work effectively. and when tissue responsiveness improves, the same intervention may begin to produce a different outcome. Let's bring this together. The problem is not always the medication. Often, the missing piece is energy. The body is not necessarily faulty. It may simply be tired. And when we look at this way, a simple model emerges. The device provides potential. Water conducts. Herbs provide structure, the scaffold, and the body responds if it can. So our role is not to force the system, but to restore the conditions in which it can function again. Energy, structure, direction. When these come together, function follows. Thank you.